Welcome to this session of literary criticism, where we will be looking into certain other aspects of the preface to the lyrical ballads. We begin with Wordsworth's opinion of metre. Wordsworth argues that the use of metre in poetry is not similar to the use of poetic diction. The distinction of metre is regular and uniform, unlike the arbitrary nature of poetic diction. Poets and readers, without their knowledge, ascribe to the established rules of metre, whereas use of poetic diction leaves the readers at the mercy of the tendencies of the poet. Metre does not interfere with passion, but diction does. The rules of metre are fixed, while there are no such rules of poetic diction. Wordsworth's defense of metre is perhaps the ineffectual part of the preface. It has been suggested that if poetic diction is artificial, metre too would be artificial, and it should be rejected for the same reasons. His view that metre has been used in the earlier times and that its rules are fixed, unlike poetic diction, is unjustifiable. Wordsworth further explains the reasons for his using verse and not prose in his poems. He has written about universal passions of men, their interesting occupations, and of the world of nature. He could have used prose to write about these subjects, but he has preferred to write in verse because the use of metre provides greater pleasure. To support his stance, Wordsworth appeals to authority and tradition. He notices that people from time immemorial have acknowledged the beauty of metrical language, and in this respect he has adhered to tradition. Some critics would comment that only a small part of poetic pleasure depends on metre, and it should be accompanied with suitable poetic diction if it has to impart satisfaction. Some critics, however, undermine the power of metre to give pleasure. That metre is itself the source of pleasure is justifiable because simple poems have continued to give pleasure since earlier times. Therefore, the poet is justified in using metre and rejecting poetic diction. Metre is used for other reasons too. The ultimate aim of poetry is to provide emotional excitement, which transports the mind to an unusual state. In such a state, ideas and feelings follow each other in a disorderly manner, and emotional excitement could be excessive or restrained. This justifies that metre possesses the ability to restrain and temper effect that is produced. Metre is regular, and as a mind is accustomed to it, its use leads to consistency and imparts the sense of being in control, thereby managing and alleviating unusual mental conditions. Pathetic and painful situations are rendered effectively by the use of metre. The distancing effect of metre strips the language of its reality and induces a surreal quality to the description. This way, the effects of the painful experiences become bearable. Pathetic scenes in Shakespeare use metre effectively to mingle pleasure with pain and mitigate the painful effects of such dismal settings. necessary emotional excitement is imparted by the use of meter. The human mind has a capacity to receive pleasure from the perception of similarity in dissimilarity or of dissimilarity in sex. It is a principle which is the basis of our pleasure in similarity, and it is for this very reason that we derive pleasure from simile and metaphor. The use of meter enhances the element of contrast. Wordsworth could not develop this point in detail for want of space, but Coleridge elaborates it in his Biographia Literaria. Let us now discuss what Wordsworth has to say about the process of poetic creation. Wordsworth's definition that poetry arises as, I quote, the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, and that it has its origin in emotions recollected in tranquility, unquote, suggests 4 stages in the process of poetic creation. They are observation, recollection, contemplation, and imaginative excitement. The poet observes certain objects and phenomena of nature which excites him with certain emotions. The poet does not express these emotions at the moment, rather he recollects those emotions later in moments of tranquility. He contemplates upon them, and the result of the deliberation is that he is once again transported to the same initial state of emotional excitement. The earlier emotions are revived, and much of the accidental, temporary, and disgusting are discarded. This makes the particular emotion universal, which is the process of creation, and gives joy to the poet. When he communicates, he conveys his own joy to the readers, and meter helps him to achieve his desires. Pathetic and painful emotions are assuaged by the use of meter, and the lighter emotions acquire ease and gracefulness. The use of meter imparts the skill to overcome artistic difficulties, which in turn gives pleasure. Meter serves to make ordinary, commonplace language of real life experiences appear different and unusual, and the contrast produces delight. For all these reasons, people prefer verse to prose. We move on to find out the criticism of Wordsworth's poems. Wordsworth arrives at the faults that critics may find with his poems. He may at times be accused of giving false importance to the subjects less worthy of poetry, and at other times be censured for momentary connection of feelings and ideas with particular words and phrases. As Wordsworth himself is not convinced of this, he would not act contrary to his feelings by modifying his language. He would not prefer to alter his poems to please the critics. It would be better to act with conviction so that self-confidence is not lost. Feeling is primary when compared to language. To prove this point, Wordsworth compares Dr. Johnson's lines from the well-known poem The Hat with the lines from the popular ballad Babes in the Wood. Though the words and the order of words in both the poems do not differ much, Babes in the Wood is poetry, for it includes noble feelings, while The Hat cannot be considered as a poem because it does not express any worthy sentiment. the reader is requested to judge his poems with reference to his own feelings and not by any external standard prescribed by literary critics. The reader is further requested to avoid carelessness while taking decisions. A poet who has once impressed the readers deserves reconsideration with reference to those pieces which fail to impress the readers initially. An accurate taste in poetry would be an acquired talent, depending upon the reader's intimate acquaintance with the best models and habits of deep and impartial thoughts. Wordsworth concludes the preface by saying that if time and space had permitted him to point out what sort of pleasure is produced by metrical composition that is different from his own, he would have made it clear to his readers that art possesses unlimited powers and that poetry is capable of producing pleasure of a purer, more exquisite and more lasting nature than which the readers have been accustomed to. In order to enjoy new poetry, they must give up relishing the kind of poetry they have been familiar with so far and take keen interest in the rather different kind of poems that he wishes them to familiarize with. He hopes that if his purpose is fulfilled, genuine poetry will be produced that would suit the interest of mankind permanently. In the end, the poet makes an earnest request to his readers to scrutinize his poems with an open and sympathetic mind, and then to determine for themselves how far the poet has succeeded in attaining his object and whether it was worth the effort. Towards the end of the lyrical ballads, he added the appendix. The content of the appendix goes this way. To the 1802 edition of Lyrical Ballads, he adds the appendix because he felt that his views on the subject could not be fully dealt within the narrow limits of the preface. In this appendix, his aim has been to give an exact idea of the sense in which the phrase poetic diction is used and to trace the origin and chief characteristics of this artificial language. The ancient poets, according to him, were moved by real feelings and emotion, and they wrote impulsively in a language that contained figures of speech, images and metaphors. However, the poets who succeeded them did not possess the intensity of feelings, but they insisted to be recognized as poets, which is a rather false claim. The neoclassic poets saw the effect of metaphorical and figurative language upon men and concluded that this language in itself was sufficient for good poetry. Therefore, they tried to reproduce this language mechanically in their poetry. The principal drawback is that, due to lack of genuine passion and feelings in their poetry, it became artificial and they could not attain the greatness of the poetry of the ancients. However, this distorted language was accepted by the readers because the effect of both types of language was delightful and the readers were alleviated to unusual states of mind. The language of the ancient poets, Wordsworth admits, was unusual and quite different from ordinary language because it was a language of extraordinary emotion written for a specific occasion. Wordsworth insists that the language they used was really spoken by men. It was not artificial, and the poet himself uttered it when he was affected by the events which he described. Meter was also superadded, thus separating it further from common life. The later poets, who were not genuinely moved by the occasion, wrote in an artificial language which nobody spoke. This was a main point of difference between the language of the ancient poets and that of the neoclassical poets. The most important reason for the acceptance of the artificial language was the notion of the peculiarity and exaltation of the poet's character, and in flattering the reader's love of the self by making them sympathize with the character. Wordsworth closes the appendix with the notion that in works that involve imagination and sentiment, ideas and feelings are important, whether the composition is in prose or verse. Adding meter to a composition is like an adventurous task and would be of little significance to the truly judicious poets. Though there are a few minor critical writings of Wordsworth, the preface remains the best among them. However, in his preface of 1815, he mentions 6 causes that lead to poetic creation. They are observation and description, sensibility, reflection, imagination and fancy, invention and judgment. We move on to Wordsworth's theory of poetry. We begin with the nature of poetry as described by Wordsworth. According to Wordsworth, emotions and feelings are important to poetry because, I quote Wordsworth, poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings and it takes its origin from emotions recollected in tranquility, unquote. The word spontaneous in the definition does not mean immediate or sudden, but it implies natural or voluntary. The poet, possessing the capacity to reconstruct his earlier emotions and feelings, is not solely concerned with the imitation of the external. His art externalizes the internal, and the feelings are the primary source of poetic creation. Poetry is the communication of emotions and not ideas, and whatever knowledge the poet imparts is through the emotions. Pleasure is aroused only when the thoughts and feelings are truthfully associated with each other. Wordsworth's statement strongly advances the concept of spontaneity, having at its base the coordination of thought and feeling. In the processes of artistic creation, observation is the first step. The poet, who possesses a greater sensibility, observes the objects of the external world, and it gives rise to certain feelings and emotions. Instead of communicating these feelings and emotions immediately to the readers, the poet allows them to settle in his mind. In the process of meditation that follows, the original feelings and emotions get transformed due to their interaction with thoughts. After the alteration, the earlier emotions and feelings get spiritualized. The impressions that a poet receives from the observation of the objects are purified of their initial ingredient and are spiritualized till what is left is the ideal or the essential truth. In tranquil moments, the poet would recall the original impressions and the feelings and emotions that would accompany them are also revived. Thus, the faculty of recreating emotions belongs to the poet. As the poet composes a poem, he lives through his original experiences that now exist in an idealized form. The artistic creation represents a complex process of observation, impression, feelings, thoughts, and their interactions. In Wordsworth's theory, special emphasis is laid on memory. Wordsworth blamed Scott for taking a notebook and making an inventory of all the pleasant objects he found in nature and finally weaving them into fabric. Let us understand what Wordsworth has to say about the subject matter of poetry in the preface to Lyrical Ballads. Wordsworth mentions the principal object in these poems was to choose incidents and situations from common life to relate or describe them throughout, as far as possible in a selection of language really used by men. Now, this is a quote from Wordsworth. This statement has been defended and attacked by critics. The poems of the Lyrical Ballads stand as a landmark in the history of English poetry and indicate a clear departure from the established notions of the neoclassical trend of Dryden and Pope. The poets of the neoclassical age gave more importance to the artificial life of the fashionable lords and ladies living in the city of London. They did not care for the expression of nature or the lives of the humble rustics in their poems. Their poetry was thus limited in its scope. Wordsworth enlarged the scope and range of English poetry by taking his themes from the lives of the rustics. He infused freshness and novelty into poetry by including nature and the life of the countryside as intimately and tenderly as he could render it with realism. By emphasizing simplicity both in theme and treatment of poems that he wrote, Wordsworth succeeded in rejuvenating the rather insipid poetry of the neoclassics. A poet, according to Wordsworth, is essentially a man speaking to men. The primary instincts and impulses which govern human behavior can be best studied in the simplest and the most elementary forms of life, which is found among the rustics. The fundamental passions of the human heart find a sincere, uninhibited and unsophisticated expression. A close observation of the manners of the rural life provides greater opportunities to a poet to trace ordinary situations which are governed by human nature and are rendered complex in the artificial and sophisticated life. The feelings and passions of the humble villagers are universal and common to all mankind. The emotions and passions of the rustics are permanent and universal because they live under the direct influence of the beauty and grandeur of nature. The reason for choosing ordinary situations in the rustic life as a suitable subject matter of poetry is that the primary affections and feelings of human nature are associated with it. Wordsworth reiterates that humble life is a proper subject of poetry because it enables a poet to understand and convey the fundamental passions of the human heart which are consistent and permanent. Let us summarize what we have done in this session. The language employed by the poet should be true to the characters in real life, because he has made efforts to understand their basic emotions. The use of artificial diction on such occasions would be ridiculous. The basic principles of life are revealed through poetic truths. The use of verse accompanies meter, which guarantees poetic pleasure. The preface concludes with the observation that poetry provides pleasure which is lofty, unique and permanent. In the appendix, Wordsworth mentions that he makes an effort to deduce the origin of the use of artificial language, which was detested by the ancient poets. Artistic creation rests on observation, impression, feelings, thoughts and their mutual interactions. In Wordsworths theory, special emphasis is given to memory. Wordsworth reiterates that humble life is the proper subject of poetry, and the poet is able to understand and convey the passions of the human heart, which remains consistent in men through the ages. All this said, we have questions for you so that you can understand what Wordsworth wanted to say in his preface to the lyrical ballads. With further notes on the preface and other areas related to it, we will discuss it in the next session. Till then, bye. Thank you.